Grace walked into the darkness of that August night, carrying nothing but 3 small treasures and the weight of a choice that could never be undone. History buried her name, but we found it. Here at Nocturne, the storyteller, this is what we do. We descend into the forgotten corners of human experience, the stories too raw, too real, too dangerous for the official record, and we bring them back into the light.
There are stories that history buries deliberately. Stories too uncomfortable, too complicated, too human to fit neatly into the official record. The story I'm about to tell you is one of them. It begins with a pair of hands. Scarred, cracked at the knuckles, stained by 18 years of lye soap, boiling water, and the particular kind of labor that destroys the body slowly, methodically, as deliberately as any act of violence. Those hands belonged to a woman named Grace, and in the blistering August heat of 1835, in a small outbuilding behind one of Charleston's most respected estates, those hands did something that would erase a woman from history entirely and set Grace free. This is the story of what happens when you take a human being and treat her like furniture for 18 years. It is a story about steam and silence and a copper wash basin that still stands somewhere, knowing everything. It is not a comfortable story. It was not meant to be. To understand what happened on that August afternoon, you need to understand where Grace came from. Not just the plantation, the specific grinding machinery of the world she was born into. The Harrogate estate sat 5 miles outside Charleston, South Carolina, a white-columned monument to cotton money and carefully maintained appearances. In 1797, the year Grace was born, it was already one of the most prosperous holdings in the county. The kind of place where silver was polished twice a week, whether it needed it or not, where every bedsheet bore a monogram, and where the cost of a fine lace handkerchief could feed a family for a month. Grace never knew her father. She knew what he was, a frequent visitor to the quarters, the kind of man whose name was spoken quietly around children, but she never knew him as a person, and he certainly never claimed her as a daughter. The evidence of his existence lived in her face, lighter skin than her mother's, a particular set to the jaw, eyes that the estate's mistress, a woman we will call Adelaide Harrow, found personally offensive from the very first day she noticed them. Grace's mother was a house slave named Ruth. Not the laundry Ruth, who would later teach Grace her trade, a different Ruth, a softer woman with beautiful hands and a talent for keeping her head down. She died of fever when Grace was 8 years old, leaving her daughter to navigate the Harrogate household alone. Adelaide Harrow made her decision quickly. The girl's small, her hands are the right size for getting into collars. Put her in the wash house. The wash house. If you've never seen one, picture this. A low-roofed outbuilding set deliberately apart from the main house because no one wanted the smell of lye and steam drifting through the parlor windows. Inside, a series of massive copper tubs, each large enough to drown in, suspended over open fires that burned from before dawn until well past dark. The floors were perpetually wet. The air was never below 90 degrees in summer. Never. The wooden walls had absorbed so much steam over the years that they'd warped and darkened to the color of a bruise. This was Grace's world at age 8. This was the world she would inhabit for the next 30 years. The woman who taught her, old Nance, the laundress before Grace, had a philosophy that she passed on with the same matter-of-fact grimness with which she taught everything else. Keep your eyes down and your thoughts to yourself. The work will try to kill you. Don't let it. The mistress will try to break you. Don't let her know if she does. Nance's hands were so damaged by the time Grace met her that she could no longer properly grip a pressing iron. 22 years in that washhouse had done what 22 years in that washhouse will do. Adelaide Harrow had her sold the following spring. Grace was 9 years old and had just become the sole laundress of Harrogate Estate. There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes from washing other people's clothes for decades. It is intimate in a way that most forms of labor are not. Grace learned the Harrogate household through its laundry. She learned that Master Thomas Harrow drank heavily on Thursdays. She could tell by the bourbon smell baked into his waistcoat cuffs. She learned that Adelaide Harrow wept in private because of the faint salt rings that appeared regularly on the inside of her pillowcases. She learned which of the children wet their beds, which of the guests drank more than they admitted, which of the visiting ladies used rouge that ran in the heat. She learned all of this, and she kept it silent, because that was the arrangement. The laundress sees everything and says nothing. The laundress is furniture. The laundress does not exist in any meaningful way. She is merely an extension of the work itself.
Adelaide Harrow reinforced this understanding daily. She was a tall woman, Adelaide, fine-boned and rigidly beautiful in the way that requires constant maintenance. She had been the foremost debutante of her Charleston social circle before her marriage, and she had carried that competitive edge with her into domestic life, channeling it into the management of her household with the same ruthless precision a general might apply to a military campaign. Every afternoon, without exception, Adelaide inspected the laundry. She moved through the hanging sheets and folded linens with her hands clasped behind her back, eyes moving over each item with the cool assessment of a judge examining evidence. A wrinkle in the wrong place, a ghost of a stain not quite removed, a collar that had been starched a fraction too stiffly. These were, in Adelaide's accounting, personal failures, moral failures, evidence of Grace's fundamental inadequacy. The first time Adelaide struck Grace, she was 9 years old and had missed a faint tea stain on a lace-edged handkerchief. "What is this?" The slap came without preamble. Grace's head snapped sideways. She did not cry. She had learned already that crying made things worse. No supper that night, extra instruction from Nance the next morning, and the memory of Adelaide's voice, silk-soft and absolutely certain. She may have her father's face, but she clearly doesn't have his intelligence. That was how Adelaide used the knowledge of Grace's parentage, not as a secret but as a weapon, never stated directly, never acknowledged openly, but wielded in small, precise cuts. References to Grace's coloring, observations about certain facial features, reminders delivered with poisonous delicacy that Grace existed because of an act no one was supposed to discuss, which made her simultaneously visible and unknowledgeable. Over the years, Grace learned to absorb these cuts the way old wood absorbs moisture, silently, invisibly, without apparent damage, though the damage accumulated regardless, the way water damage always does, hidden in the grain until the structure finally begins to give. By the time Grace was 26, she was the finest laundress in the county. This was not a compliment anyone thought to offer her directly, but she knew it from the way visiting ladies sometimes inquired about her, from the occasional requests Adelaide received to loan her services to neighboring households for special occasions. She had mastered every fabric, every stain, every chemical treatment available in that era. She knew that blood lifted most easily in cold water before heat was applied, that silk required Castile soap and the patience of a monk, that the particular yellow that invaded white linen over time could be corrected with sunlight and a specific bleaching solution she'd worked out herself through years of careful experimentation. She had also mastered the architecture of survival in a hostile environment. She knew which house slaves could be trusted and which ones reported conversations to Adelaide. She knew the rhythms of the household well enough to predict when Adelaide would appear for inspection, allowing her to always appear industriously occupied rather than simply exhausted. She knew how to make her face into something that communicated exactly nothing, a smooth surface that reflected back whatever the observer wanted to see. She had one small room attached to the wash house. It contained a pallet, a single candle holder, and a loose floorboard beneath which she kept three things: a scrap of blue fabric from one of her mother's old dresses, a small carved wooden figure, a bird in flight that a young man named Samuel had made for her before he was sold away when she was 17, and a straight razor she had found discarded in the rubbish pile outside the main house. The razor was not kept for any specific purpose. She had never used it as a weapon, had never seriously considered doing so. It was kept, she would have said if asked, because it was the sharpest thing she owned, because in a life stripped of nearly everything, there was comfort in possessing something with an edge. The years passed. Adelaide grew older. The fine lines at the corners of her eyes deepened. The angle of her jaw softened slightly. She responded to these developments by intensifying her already considerable regime of creams and lotions and careful powdering, and by intensifying, correspondingly, the exacting nature of her daily laundry inspections. Nothing Grace produced was ever quite adequate. The sheets could always have been whiter, the pressing always fractionally more precise. The timing, the moment when each item emerged from the tub, from the drying line, from beneath the iron, never quite matched the invisible standard that existed only in Adelaide's mind. Grace was 38 years old. Her hands looked 20 years older than she was. She had not left the Harrogate property in months. Something, very quietly, was beginning to give. The breaking point, when it came, arrived not as a single dramatic moment, but as the accumulation of several smaller ones, each unremarkable on its own, each adding weight to a structure that had been silently compromising for years. It began with the announcement that Adelaide's brother-in-law was coming to visit, a man named Edmund Harrow, Thomas's elder brother, who managed the family's northern properties and visited Charleston perhaps once a year. A tall, quiet man with the Harrow family's distinctive features. The same features Grace saw in her own reflection every morning.
Adelaide's response to the news of Edmund's arrival was immediate and revealing. The blue guest room was to be completely overhauled. Fresh mattress ticking, new window dressings, 3 days of airing before his arrival. And Grace was told with a directness that cut through even the usual formality of Adelaide's manner, "You will make yourself scarce when Mr. Edmund arrives. I don't want you underfoot." The instruction carried its own eloquent subtext. Grace understood it completely. The man who had helped create her was coming to visit, and Adelaide could not bear the visual evidence of that fact to be present in the same room. The shame, as always, was Grace's to carry. Then, 2 days before Edmund's expected arrival, came the comment that shifted something in Grace's architecture from stressed to compromised. Adelaide had been in an unusual state all week, tense, distracted, her critical remarks sharper than usual and less targeted, like a blade being sharpened against stone without particular care for what it would eventually cut. She arrived for inspection one afternoon and found fault with everything. Sheets not white enough, napkins not stiff enough, pillowcases bearing invisible shadows of old stains that only she could see. And then, almost conversationally, as if thinking aloud, "They're bringing steam-powered laundry machinery up north now. One machine can do the work of 3 women. I've been thinking about whether it might be time to modernize." The implications settled over Grace like cooling water. 18 years. 18 years of destroyed hands and perpetual heat and daily criticism and the systematic erosion of every boundary between herself and the work. And she could be replaced at any moment by a machine or sold to fund the purchase of one as easily and with as little ceremony as Nance had been sold before her. Grace kept her expression smooth. She said what she was expected to say. She completed the afternoon's tasks with the mechanical precision that had become her greatest survival skill. That night, by candlelight, she took out the razor and held it in her hands for a long time. She was not planning anything, not yet, but the edge was there, and it meant something, though she could not yet have said precisely what.
Edmund Horrow arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week of August. The timing could not have been worse, or perhaps better, depending entirely on which side of history you were standing on. August in Charleston was the city's most punishing month. Heat that sat on the chest like a physical weight, air thick with moisture, the kind of days that made even the wealthiest families retreat to their coolest rooms and do as little as possible. Inside the wash house, the temperature that afternoon was significantly beyond punishing. Grace had stoked the largest copper tub to its maximum temperature for the final washing of the guest room linens, the water not quite boiling but close, shimmering with heat, steam rising in slow spirals toward the warped wooden ceiling. She had not slept well in days. Adelaide arrived at 2:30 for her inspection, moving into the wash house with the particular set to her shoulders that Grace had learned to read like weather. Edmund had arrived. The household must be perfect. Adelaide's control was absolute, or it was nothing at all. The examination of the blue room linens began badly. "There is a shadow along this edge. Grace, are you even looking at what you're producing?" Grace looked at the edge in question. There was no shadow. She had been producing impeccable linen for 18 years. She knew the difference between a flaw and an invention. This was an invention. She said, "I can rewash them, ma'am. The large tub is ready." Adelaide moved toward the sorting table. Her back was to the copper tub. Her attention had shifted to the next set of items. The dinner napkins, the tablecloth, Adelaide's own evening dress which required inspection for the night's entertainment. Grace stood holding the bundle of guest room sheets, watching Adelaide's back, watching the precise, controlled way she moved her hands over the linen, watching the set of Adelaide's shoulders, that absolute certainty of a woman who had never in her life been required to question her own authority over another human being. She said, "If you'll check the temperature of the water, ma'am, it needs to be very hot for the bluing to work correctly, but not actually boiling or it damages the fibers." Adelaide turned slightly. The request was unusual. Adelaide did not assist with laundry. Adelaide inspected and criticized. But the day was unusual. Everything was slightly off its axis. She moved toward the copper tub, looking down at the shimmering water. Grace was already behind her. There is a kind of action that a person performs not out of rage, but out of clarity, not the hot, blind violence of a momentary loss of control, but something cooler, more deliberate, arrived at over 18 years of careful consideration. This was that kind of action. Grace placed both hands flat between Adelaide Harrow's shoulder blades and pushed. We will not describe in detail what followed. Some truths require only their outline. The wash house was isolated from the main house by design. Sounds did not carry. The fires were always burning. Steam always rose. The copper tub was large and deep and had been built to contain enormous heat. When it was done, Grace cleaned the floor with the same methodical attention to detail she had applied to 18 years of laundry. She stirred the water, she stoked the fire higher, and then, with the precision of a woman who understood better than anyone alive what sustained heat could do to organic matter, she waited. Adelaide Harrow did not leave the wash house that afternoon. No trace of her ever did. When the household began searching, first anxious, then frantic, then desperate, Grace answered every question with the same calm steadiness she had maintained for years. The mistress had visited, had expressed dissatisfaction with the linens, had mentioned changing her dress before the evening, had left. She answered Thomas Harrow's questions this way. She answered Edmund's questions this way. And Edmund's questions were sharper, more precise, circling the wash-house with a suspicious certainty that suggested he understood something the others did not. She answered the Charleston constabulary this way. No one seriously considered the laundress. No one ever does. Grace spent 4 more days at Harrogate after Adelaide disappeared. 4 days of washing and pressing and folding, of delivering linens to the main house, of eating her meals in the wash-house, of sleeping her few hours on her pallet and rising before dawn to begin again. During those 4 days, she also prepared. A travel permission document, forged carefully from a blank form she found in Thomas Harrow's study while delivering clean linens. A signature copied from an authentic document, practiced until her hand reproduced it without hesitation. The form authorized the bearer, Grace, Laundress, to travel to Savannah to obtain specialist supplies. 2 weeks granted for the journey. A small amount of money, saved over years in coins earned from occasional work for neighboring households. Added to this, a silver coin that Edmund Harrow had left on her sorting table after one of his questioning visits, payment for information she had not actually provided. She took it anyway. Necessity had long since outranked principle in Grace's moral accounting. On the 5th night, at 3 in the morning, she rose from her pallet for the last time, gathered her small bundle of possessions, the blue fabric, the carved bird, the razor, and paused for a moment beside the copper tub in the dark. She did not speak to it. She simply placed her hand against its curved metal side, feeling the residual warmth of the banked fire beneath it. Then she walked out into the August night and did not look back. Adelaide Harrow was never found. The official record lists her disappearance as unexplained. A woman who walked away from her Charleston estate one afternoon and was never seen again. Theories circulated for years: a nervous collapse, an accident, a secret departure. Edmund Harrow, until his death in 1849, maintained that she had been murdered and that someone in the household knew the truth. No one was ever charged with anything. The copper tub remained in the Harrogate wash-house for decades. Other hands worked beside it, other fires burned beneath it. It continued to do what it had always done. Grace disappears from the historical record at the moment she walks away from Harrogate, which is perhaps the most honest thing history could do for her. There are accounts, fragmented, unverified, passed through oral tradition rather than official documentation, of a woman matching her description arriving in Philadelphia in the autumn of 1835. A woman who took in laundry, who lived quietly, who had hands that told a story no one ever quite asked her to explain. Whether she found peace is unknowable. Whether she was haunted by steam, by the smell of lye, by the particular quality of morning light through a warped wooden window, is perhaps the more honest question. What we can say is this: she chose. In a life that had been structured from birth around the complete elimination of her choices, she made one. A terrible one, a final one, but hers. A woman's hands tell her story. Grace's story is written in places that records cannot reach.
If Grace's story moved something in you, if you felt the heat of that wash-house, if you understood, even for a moment, the terrible mathematics of a human being pushed past every limit, then you already know you belong here. Subscribe to Noctur the Storyteller, not for entertainment, for truth. The next story is already waiting for you.